Hi, I'm Yihong Zhang.
And I'm Robert Sharetta, and this is International Investor.
Robert, in this episode, we are going to focus on the relationship between the large-scale migrations of people around the world and the corruption that subjects many of them to human slavery and sex exploitation.
Exactly. You know, for quite some time, International Investor has maintained that the large-scale migrations of people from one country to another that the world has recently witnessed are not anomalies, but rather just the beginning of a growing and long-range trend.
Yeah, and in this episode, we are going to try to establish the relationship between these migrations of people and the growth in human trafficking.
You know, first though, let's back up a little and talk about the root causes of these migrations.
Well, right now, the world's focus has been on the refugees coming out of Middle East, fleeing from such places like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, where civil wars has put their families' lives at great risk.
Yes, but we think that the current wave of Syrian refugees, for example, that try to work their way into Europe are part of a much bigger picture.
Indeed, Robert, we are seeing a wave of migration to Europe, not just from the Middle East, but also from North Africa. They often have been departing from Libya, but increasingly, these refugees are not from Libya itself, but rather from a large swath of nations from across the African continent.
Right, Yihang. In one study, up to 70% of the boat refugees now arriving in Europe are from such countries as the Congo, Uganda, Nigeria, and even South Africa.
And not all of these nations are ravaged by war and violence. It seems evident that these are other forces operating which encourage them to leave their own countries to travel to a foreign land.
I believe you are making the right deduction there, because we think migrations from Africa and other parts of the world are driven more by economic reasons rather than conflicts and violence.
And Robert, it's not just the Middle East and Africa where this is occurring, but all over this world. For example, in the Western Hemisphere, we see people emigrating not just from Mexico, but increasing from Central American states and a number of countries in South America, who are winding their way north with United States and Canada as their final destinations.
In Asia, groups like the Rohingya boat people are fleeing to sail to other parts of Asia. And we all know that many Filipinos, Indonesians, Southeast Asians such as Cambodians, Thais, and Laotians, and Vietnamese are trying to move to other parts of the world in search of employment.
In search of better lives for their families.
Exactly. We think all these migrations are but a symptom of a much larger ailment: the world's rising populations of workforce age people unable to find decent jobs.
Robert, I know that International Investor has covered this issue before in your two-part series called The End of Jobs.
Right, Yihang. In those programs, we argued that the world cannot possibly keep up with the exploding work-age populations in nations like India and Nigeria and many other nation-states in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia.
Robert, I understand in India alone, they are adding more than 1 million new workers every month. If you take a look at the charts, you will see that we are forecasting booming populations of workers and unemployment through nations and regions around the world.
On one hand, we see pressures growing in all these nations from the legions of disenfranchised and discouraged young people who are unable to earn a living. And on the other hand, an increasing willingness to try their luck in leaving their home countries for a better life abroad. Yihang, you and I put some thought into some of the reasons why this is starting to occur.
Robert, we have identified 3 compelling reasons that encourage people to migrate to another nation. The first is general communications. Although radio and television have been ubiquitous in developed nations for many decades, never before have so many people in developing countries had the easy means to see on their mobile phones, tablets, and laptop computers what life is like in a world of leisure, consumption, and luxury.
And secondly, it is increasingly possible to make the move. Obviously, refugees will use any means available to arrive in another nation, often at the great risk to themselves and their families. We've seen that with the boat people in the Mediterranean. Yet in many parts of the world, we've observed another phenomenon, that the moving and smuggling of significant numbers of people across borders has become a business with revenue goals and commissions paid to facilitators, and increasingly with the help of organized crime.
And a third ingredient is social media. In times past, it used to be that when the pioneers who leave one land and those who remain behind will not receive the news and know their fate for months, years, and sometimes never.
Because there was no feedback mechanism.
Right, but with social media and mobile phone technology, the pioneers can guide those behind them every step of the way, easing their migratory path so they can avoid the pitfalls and successfully navigate between the regulatory rocks.
And there's another interesting difference that we are starting to observe. In one recent event that I attended at the Japanese Research Institute, they found that in cases of natural and man-made disasters such as Fukushima, the social benefits of a new home often made refugees less likely to return to their homeland.
Yes, and that effect can include guest workers and their family members, often being assisted by social welfare agencies in the foreign countries.
Or foreign students overstaying their visas.
Yeah. So Robert, you got a chance to go to a conference where you heard someone from Austria giving her views on the refugee crisis in Europe.
Yes, she is a member of the European Parliament, and I got a chance to ask her not just what she thought about the refugees, but whether the unemployed native people of Europe might react differently to this wave of refugees coming.
So let's go and hear what she has to say now.
International investor. You mentioned that there's a sizable European population, but you might have a different perspective on this if you're part of the unemployed or marginally employed. And some of the countries that are most affected by this migration have the highest levels of unemployment. So how do you answer those people who might feel more threatened by an influx of a great number of people who would be willing to take any job, probably at any pay?
Well, I mean, the countries that received more or less, I don't know, 80% of the influx now is Germany and Sweden. I mean, Austria has a part, but our numbers are not that big, actually. We have, officially we are speaking about 90,000 applicants. Why I'm saying this, I mean, these countries are not faced with big economic problems. Germany, Sweden, Austria, I mean, within the European Union, they are the most stable states. I do appreciate the fears of people. I mean, of course, we all have our fears and angst and dilemmas. However, in this context, I think you have to be aware, and now I'm really entering waters that can be dangerous, because I know that actually there is a journalist sitting here. No, I mean, the role of the media is actually a bit of a problem, because the pictures that we have been faced with, I mean, in the last couple of months, really give you the impression that there is like a serious invasion of people coming. I mean, that they really roll over you. But when you then look at the numbers, it doesn't add up. It is true that the influx was big, but it was a question also of how the states are able to organize this influx. And for Austria, I can tell you, and this is official language, and has been mentioned in the Austrian parliament in the plenary several times, if it would not have been for the civil society, it would have been a humanitarian disaster. what does this tell us? I mean, first of all, I would say it is a sign of a very healthy state when you have this kind of civil society organized. Yeah, so because I'm not such a big fan of only the state has to take care of everything. So this has functioned, but only thanks to Caritas, to SOS, Asyl, and you name all of them, all of the private people that were really there. The state is now only getting in. I mean, all the state institutions. So we will see how this will now work out, and now it's getting more complicated. I don't have an answer to people who have fears, but you also as a politician and as a human being, you just have to accept that sometimes there are situations that I cannot choose. I cannot choose if you have refugees coming or not. This is like you would like to choose good or bad weather. It is nothing that you can decide. You have to deal with it. And this is what I request actually the political, the people who are actually really responsible and in charge to deal with it.
Oh, I'm shocked by some of the things she said. First of all, is she unaware of the serious unemployment problems in Europe? Look at the numbers on these charts. Yeah, there are huge numbers of unemployed and underemployed the people there.
And secondly, she argued that the people of Europe must accept these people as a humanitarian gesture and be willing to care for all of these, quote, women and children. Yet one recent report makes it clear that up to 60 to 70% of those applying for refugee status are not women and children, but able-bodied men. Incidentally, I can't help but ask why these men are not back home fighting for their home nations and their loved ones there. You know, Yihang, I can tell you without equivocation that if any terrorist group or nation state ever threatened the U.S. seriously, 99% of our able-bodied men and women would fight to their deaths before fleeing their homes.
And has she calculated the cost to each European nation and the additional burden it will put on their taxpayers? Robert, what was your overall impression of her?
I found her to be obviously intelligent, extremely articulate, and very, very naive.
What brings us to the entire question that how nations could, should, and are reacting to this wave of immigration. I have noticed that not all nations are willing to take in the refugees. You never hear about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman opening their borders to Syrian or Iraqi refugees. And I understand that Israel even is trying to deport many residents of North American descent.
Right, and now it's clear that the Europeans are beginning to change their minds. 10 nations of Europe are taking measures to choke off the migration waves from Greece. These countries include Macedonia, Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and even her home nation of Austria.
And the Western European nations are also becoming alarmed, including Germany, Spain, France, and even the UK. Some of the recent incidents in Cologne, Germany, and France are changing people's mind about the risks associated with the refugees.
All of the political figures in Europe are under immense pressure now because of the growing right-wing anti-immigrant forces in their nations. You know, at International Investor, we first reported on these stirrings last year in a special report we did from Poland. Now, the French recently deported several thousand people from the infamous jungle at Calais, and the United Kingdom has taken explicit measures to prevent refugees from entering their nation through the railroad tunnel between Normandy and southeast England.
Well, Robert, it has become a political football in the US presidential election as well. We have heard from Donald Trump about building his version of a Great Wall in Mexico to open debates about the merits and downsides of migration into the US and the illegal aliens that are already here.
And as we explained earlier, these won't just refer to immigrants from Mexico, but increasingly we're going to see people from Venezuela, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, and all the Central American states heading north.
And Robert, there is a big issue that even those people in favor of immigration choose to ignore. Many of these people are in extremely vulnerable situations and run the risk of exploitation.
Absolutely. Think about it. People come with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. They are desperately hungry with no means of employment. They are totally dependent on those who offer and provide them with any means of survival, no matter how low the pay, no matter how debasing the activity and dangerous the work. Refugees can be subject to what amounts to slavery at work, and particularly the women and children are subject to exploitation and sex trafficking.
And I understand that in many cases, the victims participate in the conspiracy of silence because they don't want to cut off the only means of survival that is sustaining them. So they keep the secret, no matter how terrible the impact on their lives.
Yes, and I went to a conference recently on corruption and human slavery, where one of the presenters coined the phrase sexploitation. Let's go and listen to him now.
As you think about the law, in most countries, laws pertaining to corruption deal with the exchange of money, the extortion of money, the extortion of bribes. But just remember that when it comes to petty corruption, not grand corruption, there are thousands and thousands of women and girls whose lives are being ruined because people in power are asking sexual favors from them rather than money. This form of sextortion is a form of corruption that gets no attention whatsoever. It's not even really attacked by the major women groups around the world, and yet it should. And it's a culture of male supremacy, if you will, in so many countries where women and girls, particularly in poor countries, and poor women and poor girls, are the victims of sexual acts, sexual favors because of corruption.
I think he's right. Clearly, this practice goes on and on.
And it's often conducted by the very agencies, border control agents, and bureaucrats who are in charge of their entry into the country, or their general welfare, and their work opportunities, and even their fight to find legal status in the new country.
And much of this is never reported. Did you see the article about more than 10,000 children missing in our recent wave of Central American refugees? And who knows where they are and who could be exploiting them?
So I say this, the very people in favor of these kinds of immigrations are actually putting many of the women and children and men at risk for their own health, their dignity, and their very lives in some cases.
And all of the major world organizations are indicating that the problem of human trafficking is getting worse. It is hard to imagine that happens in this time of human history. You would think that our societal evolution on the planet would have stopped it by now, but it keeps on going. What do you think the reason is?
It's the sheer numbers. You know, the world's human population is continuing to grow, and the young workforce within is growing even faster. So in desperation, they are pressed to leave their home nations in search of better lives, which subjects more and more of them to exploitation.
So Robert, you also heard from a population expert who gave her view of why we had all better be thinking about controlling the human population growth. So let's go to her now.
I think that we have had experience with top-down approaches to population growth, and they don't work very well. They result in coercion, they result in unnecessary deaths.
Interesting, you hardly ever hear a politician in the US, Europe, or multilateral agencies, or even the humanitarian agencies and NGOs talk about critical issues of population control anymore.
No, they all want to avoid it because of religious and other reasons. But the very tyranny of population mathematics, as I like to call it, will be the undoing of us all.
Robert, you hear many people in the US promoting immigration, and the media always use positive terms. What do you think the reason is?
There are indeed natural forces which promote the ideas that immigration and a growing population are good for the country. You know, here in the United States, the immigrant populations are already becoming increasingly vocal and represent sizable political constituencies. No politician can ignore it. But maybe more importantly, big business represented by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the high technology sector seem to love the idea of acquiring cheaper, skilled and unskilled labor here in the U.S. to compete with the native-born workers. Keeps wages down low. Economists promote the idea of growth at every economic forum we go to. And it stands to reason that if you have an expanding population, you will increase the demand for production and consumption of more goods and services. So you have an economic push from it. And politically, presidents, Federal Reserve chairs, secretaries of Treasury, and secretaries of Commerce are always in favor of more economic growth. Europe is also being told the same thing, even as they attempt to cut their government spending. So in effect, one could argue that bringing foreigners to boost your population and workforce is a last desperate effort to promote economic growth at the cost to your own native-born citizens.
How did the lady from Austria justify her position and ask that Europe handle these problems when they have such severe economic and unemployment problem themselves, whether she realizes or not?
Yes, I wanted to ask her one specific question in addition to what I did. When these refugees come to your neighborhood, are you willing to voluntarily take a family into your home for 1 year, 2, 3, or more? Only if you answer yes to that question will I believe you are truly willing to present yourself as being in favor of immigration and willing to make the humanitarian sacrifice that you are suggesting your fellow taxpayers should make on your behalf. You know, there's that old expression, put up or shut up. Well, our wrinkle on it is, put them up or shut up. Yihang, how would people in China react to a wave of foreigners who may want to come enter your country permanently and take a job?
If you think about it, for 50 years, China has implemented our one-child policy to control our population booming. The Chinese people did not accept this policy because our human nature is to have less babies, but to contribute to a better society and stronger economy. Recent history reminds them of how hard it is to go from a starvation to a prosperous society with decent jobs and pay for most people. So, Robert, do you think it is fair to ask Chinese people who have sacrificed so much to surrender any of these gains or give away their jobs to foreigners who haven't sacrificed anything or will not even subject themselves to China's future birth control policy?
You know, the answer I would give is no. I don't think it's fair to the Chinese people, nor do I think it's fair to the American people or the people in any society to be asked to make the same sacrifices unless the same was being asked of the foreigners who entered their land.
But Robert, where is this migration movement heading as we look ahead?
Well, we think that the current migrations that people are so upset about now, in Europe for example, are but a tip of the population iceberg in the near future. If 1 or 2 million refugees to Europe are causing such havoc now, Wait until they see 10, 20, 30 million people coming from the Middle East and Africa. And we see similar geometric expansion of refugee waves from Latin America and Asia that are just beginning to develop. In one worldwide survey, it was found that 1 in 7 people on the planet indicated that they would consider and are likely to search for a better life in another nation. We estimate that by 2030, less than 15 years from now, the world will witness hundreds of millions of people moving from one nation to another to seek a better life. You know, these tsunamis of people are just beginning to unfold before our eyes now. No matter who wins the U.S. presidential election in the U.S., the problem will become a big issue for the next White House and the world. I think you will see a rise of anti-immigrant, right-wing nationalistic parties taking power everywhere, and the politics and immigration policies will be dominated by them around the world. This turmoil has just begun.
Remember, you heard it first from the international investor. I am Yi Hong Zhang. Thank you for watching.
And I'm Robert Sharetta. We'll see you next week.